In the humid summer of 1857, in the pine-shadowed valleys of North Carolina, a story began that the locals whispered only when the candles burned low and the shutters were drawn tight. It was a year marked by famine, drought, and sickness. But none of those horrors compared to the woman they would soon know as the bride. They said she moved like smoke, her eyes deep as wells, her lips painted with a red so unnatural it seemed not of powder but of blood itself. Her kiss was a sacrament and a curse, the first taste of eternity and the last breath of a man's life. Men in the village who courted her did not return the same. Some vanished without trace. Others were found cold in their beds, lips blackened, their faces still frozen in an expression of rapture, as though death had come not with struggle, but with pleasure. Wives cursed her name, mothers forbade their sons to speak to her, but still, men were drawn to her presence as moths to flame, and one by one, they surrendered. It was said she carried a veil of lace that had once belonged to her mother, a woman burned at the edge of the woods for witchcraft when the bride was a child. And every time she lowered that veil over her lips, the night grew colder, and another man's fate was sealed. What was she? A woman born of grief? A widow who had seen too much suffering? Or was she, as the whispers claimed, an heir to an older covenant, a pact with forces that thrived on the hunger of human souls? The Bride of North Carolina was not a tale written in the safety of fiction. Her name appears in parish records, in county papers, in the journals of men too frightened to speak aloud what they had seen. And yet, the deeper you search for her, the more the truth begins to blur, erased, hidden, buried under layers of silence. Someone wanted her story forgotten, someone feared what her legacy revealed, and tonight, I will bring her back. But beware, once you hear this truth, you cannot return unchanged. You will carry her lips, her veil, her curse with you. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The North Carolina of 1857 was not the South of sweet romance painted in books. It was a land raw with conflict. The plantations whispered with rebellion, the forests hid runaway slaves, and the air itself seemed pregnant with violence. A nation was about to split open. But before the first cannons roared, small towns carried their own wars in silence. Wars of faith, of blood, of desire. In this place, ordinary life struggled to keep its rhythm. Women fetched water from wells, where the moss grew thick and black. Men broke their backs, ploughing fields that gave little grain. Children played in the dust, their laughter thin beneath the constant weight of rumor. And above all, the church towered as judge and warden. Pastors thundered against sin while secretly drinking, secretly lusting, secretly burying their own transgressions. Every town had its hypocrisy. Every preacher had his secrets. But this town, it had the bride, and her presence shattered the fragile illusion of order. At first, people said she was just a girl wronged by fate, a woman who had lost her family to fever, who wore sorrow like a cloak. But the signs were always there. Animals avoided her path. Candles flickered out when she entered a room. And when she smiled, men felt not joy, but a strange trembling deep in their bones. The church tried to warn against her, but warnings only heightened desire. Sermons turned into secret fantasies. Pastors condemned her by day and sought her by night. And the town, already trembling on the edge of war, began to rot from within. Each kiss was not just the end of a man. It was a crack in the mask of civilization. It revealed what lay beneath: hunger, lust, corruption, the truth of how fragile their control really was. And so, her story is not merely about a woman who kissed husbands before killing them. It is about the forces that allowed her to exist, the corruption of power, the silence of wives who were powerless, the arrogance of men who believed they could touch fire and not be burned. She was not a witch nor a saint. She was the mirror they refused to face. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Her real name was Anna Catherine Holt, That is what the surviving church ledger tells us, though in whispers, she was simply the bride. Born in 1836, Anna was the daughter of a mill worker and a seamstress. By all outward measures, she was ordinary. A girl who helped with laundry, who gathered herbs in the forest, who carried baskets of bread to the poor. Yet even as a child, she was marked. When her mother was accused of witchcraft in 1842, the girl of only 6 years was forced to watch as flames consumed the body of the only protector she had known. Witnesses say she did not scream, she did not cry. She stood still, eyes fixed upon the fire, her small hands pressed against her lips. That silence haunted the town more than any outburst could have. After that night, Anna was treated as cursed. Children shunned her, mothers muttered prayers when she passed, and men, though wary, were unable to look away from her strange beauty as she grew. At 16, she was already spoken of in half-fevered tones, her hair black as coal, her skin pale as frost, her lips touched with a redness that never seemed to fade. She had the look of both funeral and feast, but what made her unforgettable was not her beauty. It was her presence. People said that when she entered a room, she carried the air out of it. Conversation faltered, candles dipped low, and every man's gaze was dragged toward her against his will. They said she could stop arguments with a glance, turn anger to trembling, and silence pride with a smile. What was this? Some whispered sorcery, inherited from her mother. Others said it was trauma, her childhood carved into her soul, giving her a strange dominion over others. Whatever it was, the effect was undeniable. At 19, she married a traveling merchant, her first husband. They said she kissed him on their wedding night, and by dawn he was dead, lips darkened, breath frozen in his chest, though the summer heat sweltered outside. The town doctor declared it a seizure of the heart, but neighbors told a different story. They swore the man had been smiling even as death took him, smiling as if what killed him was sweeter than life itself. From that night, Anna wore only white, as if mourning perpetually, or perhaps as a bride forever waiting. And when another man died under her kiss, and then another, her name was sealed. She became not Anna Catherine Holt, but the bride. The town could not decide what she was. Some saw her as a curse, a walking reminder of God's wrath upon their sins. Others whispered that she was a punishment sent not from God, but from something older, something buried in the soil of Carolina, long before churches were built and hymns were sung. But there were those who felt the pull of her presence not with dread, but with awe. They spoke of her as if she were chosen, a vessel of forbidden power, the kind of woman whispered about in old European folk tales, carried across the ocean with immigrants who feared witches more than hunger itself. By 1857, 3 men had died after sharing her kiss. The pattern was undeniable. Each death carried the same signature: lips stained black, hearts collapsed in their chests, bodies left in an almost serene posture, as if they had not fought death but welcomed it. And yet, no rope was tied around her neck, no trial convened. Why? Because every man who accused her found his tongue faltering, and those who gathered evidence, a glove left in her room, a lock of hair at the scene of death, somehow misplaced it, as though their own minds betrayed them. Even the sheriff, a man known for severity, lost all resolve when she stood before him, her eyes glimmering like wet stones in the lantern light. But the wives, they saw what others could not deny. They saw their husbands slipping from their arms into Anna's gaze, caught in her orbit, unable to resist. They whispered of forming their own tribunal, of dragging her to the river and tying stones to her ankles. Yet fear kept them still. Not fear of the law, but fear of what she might do if crossed directly. Stories grew. A farmer's cow found dead after his wife spread gossip about Anna. A child struck with fever after mocking her in the street. Were these coincidences? Or was the bride reaching out with hands unseen? Her veil became the most dreaded image in town. On nights when the mist rolled through the streets, people claimed to see her figure drifting, the lace of her veil shimmering pale in moonlight. Men swore they heard footsteps behind them, soft and measured, though when they turned, nothing was there. Women locked their doors, pressed crucifixes to their children's chests, and prayed. But prayer seemed useless, for the deaths continued. One by one, husbands fell. And the question that haunted every heart was not simply, will she strike again? It was far darker. Whose husband will she choose next, and will he go willingly? The fourth husband's death shattered the fragile silence. His name was Elias Turner, a man of 35, known for his strength, his booming laugh, his presence in every church gathering. He was the kind of man no one expected to fall, and yet, after a single evening in Anna's presence, he was gone. They found him at dawn in his barn, his body slumped against a beam, lips blackened as though poisoned, eyes wide open, gazing upward at nothing. His hands were folded upon his chest as, though laid out for burial, though no one had touched him. The doctor wrote the same words he always wrote: failure of the heart. But the people were no longer convinced. Rumors spread faster than scripture. They said Elias had been seen walking with Anna the night before, his hand brushing hers, his face flushed with a smile not meant for his wife. They said she had leaned close, whispering words only he could hear, before lowering her veil and pressing her lips to his. Witnesses swore that after the kiss, Elias staggered, clutching his chest, but laughing as if he had been blessed, not cursed. The wives of the town could bear it no longer. They gathered in secret, meeting in the back room of the Cooper's house, the shutters drawn tight, the air thick with candle smoke. There, with shaking hands, they laid their plans. They spoke of ancient protections, salt lines across doorways, herbs burned at the threshold, psalms recited backward. One woman, her voice trembling, suggested that perhaps Anna's power came not from sin, but from a pact, and that pacts could only be broken with blood. Meanwhile, the men of the town remained divided. Some cursed her name, vowing to put her on trial. But others, though they would never admit it, dreamed of her in the night. They awoke with sweat on their skin, and her image in their mind, lips like flame, eyes like ice. Even as their neighbors' husbands died, they longed for the taste of her kiss, as though death at her hands would be worth more than a lifetime without her. The bride was no longer merely a woman. She was a question, a test. Was she the punishment of God, sent to expose the weakness of men? Or was she proof that the world was ruled not by the holy, but by forces older, darker, unbound by scripture? And in that question lay the deepest fear of all. If she could turn death into ecstasy, how many men would choose her willingly? And how many had already done so? By the time the fifth man fell, the town was no longer whispering, it was screaming. His name was Robert Hale, a schoolteacher known for his rigid morals, a man who scolded children for laughter during lessons and quoted scripture as though it were his own blood. Of all the husbands in town, he was the least likely to wander, and yet one evening he was seen walking into the woods with Anna at his side. When dawn came, only she returned. They found Robert 3 days later, lying beneath the pines, his body half buried in needles, as if the forest itself had tried to cover his shame. His lips, like the others, were stained black. His face, however, bore something new, a faint smile, fragile and twisted, as though even in his final breath he had discovered something he dared not speak of. The men gathered around him spat and cursed. The women clutched their children tighter, but none dared accuse Anna openly. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her veil drawn, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. The pastor thundered from the pulpit the next Sunday. He declared her the devil's handmaiden, a blasphemy in flesh, and demanded that the town rise against her. But his words fell hollow, for in the pews many men sat silent, their eyes fixed not on the cross above, but on Anna herself, who had taken her place at the very back of the church. She did not flinch, she did not tremble, and when the pastor shouted for her to repent, she lifted her head, looked him in the eyes, and smiled. The pastor's voice broke, his sermon crumbling into silence. It was then the town realized the truth. Authority meant nothing in her presence. Neither law nor scripture could bind her. She was beyond their reach, and every man who tried to rise against her found himself faltering, as though she drew strength from their resistance itself. The wives began to lose hope. "She will take them all," one woman whispered. "Every husband, every son, until there is nothing left." Others insisted she must be destroyed, yet none dared strike first. For what if they failed? What if her kiss did not kill swiftly but lingered, draining slowly like poison? And so, fear fed silence, and silence fed power. Anna walked the town freely, dressed in white, her veil trailing like mist. She did not need to hide. She knew the truth. Every man was already hers, whether he had tasted her lips or not. By midsummer, the town no longer felt like itself. Once a place of church bells and market chatter, it now pulsed with unease, as though every shadow carried Anna's outline. Children no longer played in the square. Their mothers clutched them close, warning them never to look Anna in the eye. The men, though outwardly defiant, could not escape her pull. Some dreamed of her, waking in the night drenched in sweat, whispering her name beside their wives who pretended to be asleep. Others began to vanish in twos and threes. Hunters, mill workers, even a sheriff's deputy. They would be seen last at her door, or walking into the pines where she was known to wander. Their bodies would return broken, drained, lips blackened like the others before them. It was then the wives formed their first secret gathering. By lamplight in a cellar, they sat in silence, their faces pale, their voices low. They were not women who trusted each other by nature. Jealousy and gossip had long kept them apart, but Anna had made them sisters in grief. They spoke of curses, of poisons, of sins too great for God's forgiveness. "If we do not stop her," said one, "there will be no men left in Holloway by winter." Yet when the question came, who will confront her? Silence smothered the room. Each woman feared the same truth, that to face Anna was to fall under her spell. Outside, Anna's influence grew more brazen. She walked unveiled now, her hair loose, catching the light like a crown. Men stared openly, wives slapped them, and yet no shame could break the trance. The pastor, desperate to reclaim order, declared a fast, 3 days of prayer, no food, no wine, no indulgence. But the men wavered. On the second day, half abandoned the church and drifted toward Anna's home, drawn as if by invisible threads. By the third, the fast had collapsed entirely. The pastor himself fell ill that week, bedridden, his voice gone. Some whispered Anna had touched even him. The town council attempted law. They spoke of exile, of driving her out, but each meeting ended the same way, with men arguing fiercely in her defense, insisting she was innocent, misunderstood, a victim of gossip. No resolution could stand, because too many of them were already bound to her, whether by touch or by dream. Thus, Holloway stood paralyzed, the women burning with rage and fear, the men walking like sleepwalkers toward their doom, and Anna, silent as ever, needed only to smile, for the town itself did her bidding. Autumn arrived in Holloway, and with it came the harvest, a time when fields once alive with laughter and sweat now stood heavy with silence. The men worked slower, distracted, some abandoning the rows entirely to linger near Anna's house. Even those who stayed in the fields carried the sickness of distraction, their tools dull, their bodies weakened as if their very blood had been thinned by her touch. Wives, desperate to save their families, tried to tether their husbands to hearth and farm. They locked doors, prayed louder. Some even forced their men to sleep with Bibles under their pillows, but it was useless. At night, the men would slip out like ghosts, barefoot in the dirt, walking toward Anna's window as if guided by a single heartbeat. The women began to notice a darker pattern. It was not just the men who vanished, but the strongest, the most promising, the ones who carried authority or ambition. Anna was selecting carefully. The mill owner's son, the blacksmith, a merchant who controlled grain-priked. Chapon, Each had fallen after her kiss, their lives cut short, their power dissolved into the soil. Holloway was not merely losing men, it was losing its pillars, its protectors, its leaders. The women whispered now of empire, of a design too deliberate to be chance. Anna was not simply cursed. She was dismantling the town one kiss at a time. Some claimed to see her walking beyond the borders, deep into the old woods where the ground was thick with roots and forgotten graves. She carried jars, they said, filled with a dark liquid that shimmered like oil under the moonlight. One boy swore he saw her pour it into the stream, after which the fish floated lifeless on the surface. When he told his mother, she slapped him silent, too afraid of what truth might mean. The wives, united in their fear, tried one last act of resistance. They approached the oldest woman in town, a widow named Clara, who had lived through famine, war, and plague. Clara listened, her hands folded, her eyes sharp as glass. When the wives finished, Clara spoke a single warning. "Do not think she is of this town. She is older than your fathers, older than the soil you farm, and if you confront her, you will not survive." Her words spread like fire, chilling even the bravest hearts. And so the harvest passed in dread. The barns filled with grain, but no one celebrated. The air was heavy, the nights long, and the people of Holloway understood that what had begun as whispers of death had become a destiny from which there was no return. Winter drew its shadow across Holloway, and with it came the silence of a community that no longer belonged to itself. Snow muffled the streets, burying the footprints of men who walked toward Anna's home at night, as though the earth itself wished to conceal their shame. Chimneys that once smoked with life now stood cold because too many fathers had vanished. Too many sons were buried before their time. The women carried the weight of survival alone, feeding children, tending fires, digging graves with frostbitten hands. But none of it could conceal the deeper wound, the invisible sickness that Anna had unleashed upon the very soul of the town. Inside her house, she remained untouchable. No illness touched her skin, no season seemed to weather her beauty. A candle burned in her window each night, and with it the promise of both salvation and death. Those who went inside often never returned, and those who did came back half-formed, their eyes hollow, their lips pale, as if part of them had been left behind in her chambers. When questioned, they spoke little. Some smiled faintly, as though remembering a pleasure they could not describe. Others wept quietly, unable to explain what had been taken from them. Rumors turned darker still. Midwives whispered that Anna had never bled as other women did, that no child had ever grown in her womb despite countless unions. "She is not barren," one midwife said, her voice trembling. "She is unwilling. She does not take life to create. She takes it to consume." And that idea spread quickly, that every kiss was not a symbol of affection, but an act of feeding, a harvest of energy, draining men not simply of their strength, but of their very essence. The women begged the council again to act, but the council was crippled, its members already compromised. One night, when the snow fell heavier than ever before, two wives tried to set Anna's house ablaze. They carried torches, their hearts pounding with both terror and hope. Yet before they could strike, the torches extinguished themselves in the wind, leaving the women in darkness. From inside, a single candle flared, and Anna appeared in the doorway, her face calm, her lips curved into a knowing smile. She did not speak. She only raised her hand, and the women fled into the snow, certain that if they had lingered another breath longer, their hearts would have stopped inside their chests. By the turn of the year, Holloway had ceased to resist. What once was fear had become resignation. The people no longer asked whether Anna was guilty. They only prayed she would not choose their husbands next. The first real crack in Anna's shadowed reign came not from a priest, not from a council member, but from a boy, no older than 12, with frost still clinging to the cuffs of his boots. He was the son of one of Anna's visitors, a merchant whose name had been spoken with respect throughout Holloway until the night he crossed her threshold. The man never came home. The boy, restless and unwilling to accept the hollow silence that replaced his father, followed the path to Anna's house one moonless evening. He hid in the snowdrifts, his breath fogging in the bitter air, waiting, watching. Hours passed until he saw a lantern move behind her window. At first it glowed steady, then flickered, then dimmed as if suffocated by unseen hands. A figure appeared. His father. But the boy's eyes widened with horror. His father's gait was uneven, his shoulders bent, his face drained of color as though he had aged 20 years in a single night. Behind him, framed in that cursed candlelight, Anna stood. She touched her lips with one finger, slow and deliberate, then pressed it to the man's neck. He staggered, and though he walked, the boy swore he saw his father's soul peel away like breath on glass. The boy ran. He told his mother, who screamed, who roused neighbors, who carried the tale in whispers through every frost-bitten street. But Holloway had become a place where truth was poison. The council scolded the boy for lies. The priest called it a childish dream. Yet behind closed doors, people admitted what they had always feared. The woman was killing, and she was doing it in plain sight. One farmer, desperate for proof, crept near Anna's home at dawn. In the snow behind her bar, then he found shapes, shallow depressions where bodies had been dragged. He pressed his hand into one, feeling the frozen outline of what could only have been a man's shoulder. He did not speak of it aloud, but he told his wife, who told her sister, and soon the entire town buzzed with the secret. Still, no one acted. Fear had grown into paralysis. Anna's eyes were everywhere, her smile echoing in their dreams. And so the town waited, helpless, until death touched their own doors. Holloway was no longer a community, but a hive living under one queen, and every man was both her prey and her possession. The breaking point came when winter began to loosen its grip, and thaw exposed what snow had hidden. In early March, a group of children wandered along the frozen creek that ran behind Anna's property. They had gone there to test the thinning ice, daring one another to run across its slick surface before it cracked beneath their boots. But instead of laughter, the creek returned screams. Beneath the brittle skin of ice, just inches below, a pale face stared upward. The eyes were open but unseeing, the mouth frozen mid-breath, as though the man had tried to call for help before the cold seized him forever. The children ran home, dragging fear like a shadow. Fathers and brothers followed their cries and returned with shovels and axes, breaking through the ice. What they pulled from the water silenced Holloway for days. It was not one man, but three. Their bodies lay entombed, pressed against one another as though hidden in a common grave carved by winter itself. Their clothes marked them as local men, each known to the town. One had vanished months earlier, another just weeks ago, the third only days before. And though death had stiffened their limbs, the wounds around their necks told a story none wished to speak aloud. Bruises shaped not like rope or iron, but lips. The council had no choice now. To bury the discovery would be impossible. Too many eyes had seen. Rumors became proclamations, and proclamations became panic. The women wailed openly in the streets, cursing Anna's name with trembling voices. Some men, driven by anger, demanded torches and ropes. Others, still bound by her strange spell, defended her with hollow words. She is innocent. She is misunderstood. This is the will of God, not her hand. That night, Anna did not hide. She walked through the town square beneath the stars, her gown dragging in the thawing mud, her hair glistening like black fire in the lantern light. People stepped back as she passed, but she smiled at them all, not with fear, not with defiance, but with ownership. As if the discovery of her victims was not her downfall, but her unveiling. As if she had wanted them to find the ice, to see the truth, to admit that Holloway belonged to her now, not to themselves. The men buried the bodies quickly, but the silence that followed was heavier than the earth they shoveled. For the first time, Holloway was forced to face what it had always known. The bride's kisses were death. and she had been burying her husbands beneath the ice all along. The discovery of the frozen dead forced Holloway into a decision it had long avoided. Would they continue to bow beneath Anna's shadow, or would they risk everything to challenge her? For days the village split itself apart in whispers and arguments. At the tavern, where the last warmth of community still lived in mugs of ale and the crackle of firewood, voices clashed until fists slammed tables. Half the men, gaunt with grief, swore that Anna must be seized and judged. The other half, hollow-eyed and trembling, begged them to stay silent, insisting that to strike at her was to strike at fate itself. Yet fate, like ice, cracks under weight. The widows, women who had lost husbands to her lips, gathered together in secret. They spoke not with rage, but with exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep despair that no longer fears consequence. One among them, her shawl torn and her hands red from work, said what none had dared. "If the men will not act, then we will." And so they planned. But even before their plan could take shape, Anna made her move. On the third night after the bodies were found, she invited the councilmen to her home under the guise of answering their charges. They entered, 5 in number, their boots crunching against frost as they crossed her threshold. Hours passed. The candles burned low in the council hall as wives and sons waited for their return. Only 2 emerged. Their faces were pale, their eyes blank as mirrors. When asked what had happened inside, they spoke the same phrase in the same toneless voice. "She is innocent." Nothing more. That moment shattered the last illusion. It was no longer a question of guilt. Anna had power, power that bent wills, stole breath, and bound souls. The council was no longer the council. Holloway was no longer its own. And so, beneath a moon that looked more like bone than light, the townsfolk gathered. They brought torches, pitchforks, and hammers. They prayed aloud, their words trembling, their voices breaking, but still they came. Not because courage had filled their hearts, but because fear had left them no choice. And yet, as they stood at the edge of Anna's yard, fire blazing in their hands, they saw her silhouette waiting in the doorway. She was not afraid. She was not hiding. She raised her hands as if in welcome, and for a moment the mob faltered. What kind of creature greets its own executioners with a smile? The crowd of Holloway surged forward, their torches crackling in the cold night air, but every step toward Anna's doorway felt heavier than the last. It was as though the earth itself had thickened into mud, holding their boots, whispering that to cross her threshold was to cross into death. Yet rage carried them. The widows wailed at the front, their voices shrill and broken, calling for justice, calling for vengeance. The men followed, half out of duty, half out of terror, that refusing would mark them next. Anna did not move. Her silhouette stood in the candlelight of her doorway, her white gown untouched by the filth of the street. She raised her hands as though blessing them, and for an instant the flames in the torches bent sideways, pulled toward her like breath to a drowning mouth. The mob gasped, clutching their burning brands tighter, but the fire seemed to dim as they advanced. One man, braver or more desperate than the rest, lunged forward with an axe. His shout split the air, but before the blade could fall, Anna's gaze locked on him. His body stiffened mid-stride, his axe slipping from his hands. He fell face first into the mud, motionless, his torch sputtering out beside him. A scream tore through the crowd, not from Anna, but from his wife. She knelt beside his body, shaking him, but his chest did not rise. His eyes stared wide, not with pain, but with the glassy emptiness of a man who had been emptied of himself. Panic rippled through the mob. Some turned to flee, others pressed forward, but the fire in their torches guttered and died one by one, leaving them in darkness save for the glow of Anna's doorway. She stepped forward now, her bare feet silent on the frozen ground. "You come with fire," she said, her voice soft yet carrying to every ear. But what is fire to ice? What is rage to eternity? The villagers trembled, for it was not only sound they heard. Her words pressed inside their skulls, whispering in places speech had no right to enter. The strongest among them dropped to their knees, clutching their heads as though her voice were splintering bone. Yet even then, some refused to yield. A widow, her face streaked with ash and tears, hurled a stone that struck Anna's temple. For a moment's silence, the crowd held its breath. Then Anna turned her head slowly back toward them, blood running in a thin crimson line down her cheek. But instead of anger, she smiled. That smile was worse than violence. It told them she was no victim, no mortal woman. She was the storm itself, and Holloway was already drowning. The stone that had drawn blood should have been a victory, a spark to ignite the mob's fury. But instead it became their undoing. Anna wiped the crimson streak from her temple with 2 fingers and lifted them to her lips. Slowly, deliberately, she tasted her own blood. And when her tongue brushed against it, a sigh escaped her mouth, not of pain, but of pleasure. The crowd recoiled, for in that sound was hunger, a hunger that had no end. She stepped further into the night, the wind pulling at her gown, her black hair trailing like smoke. The torches had gone cold, leaving only the pale light of the moon to illuminate her face. And in that light, her eyes seemed wrong, reflecting silver, as though the moon itself lived inside her gaze. Children cried, women shrieked, and men who had come with blades found their hands trembling too violently to lift them. Then she began to speak, not to one, but to all. "You are not my enemies," she whispered, though every ear heard her clearly. "You are my children, your lives, your grief, your blood. All of it flows into me, and through me. You endure." Her words pressed against their hearts like a hand, and one by one men lowered their weapons. Their wives shouted at them to resist, but the men stared ahead, blank and transfixed, as though Anna's voice had poured honey into their veins. The widow who had cast the stone staggered back, clutching her chest. Her breath grew ragged, her face pale. Anna's silver eyes fixed on her, and the woman collapsed to her knees, gasping as though invisible lips were pressed against her throat. She clawed at the air, but no hand touched her. The crowd froze, powerless to intervene, as Anna lifted her chin and inhaled. The widow shuddered once, twice, and then fell still. Silence wrapped the village like a shroud. Anna bent and placed a final kiss on the dead woman's forehead, leaving behind a stain of frost where her lips had touched. When she rose again, the villagers stepped back in terror, their mob broken, their courage stolen. Some ran into the night, tripping over themselves in the mud. Others stood rooted, unable to flee, unable to fight. Anna watched them scatter, and her smile deepened. "Now you see," she said softly, almost tenderly. "There is no judgment. There is only devotion." She spread her arms, and the night seemed to bow around her, as though even the wind had surrendered. Holloway's rebellion had ended before it began. From that moment forward, Anna did not need to hide. She was no longer a bride whispered of in fear. She was a sovereign, and her reign had just begun. In the weeks that followed the night of the failed uprising, Holloway learned the weight of submission. Where once Anna moved in shadows, she now walked the streets openly, her presence like frost creeping through every doorway. At dawn she would pass through the square, and no one dared meet her eyes. Farmers stopped their ploughing to bow their heads. Mothers pulled their children indoors, whispering prayers that had long ago stopped working. The town had no priest anymore. The church doors stayed locked, its bells silenced. Those who had once promised salvation had either fled or fallen beneath her touch. It was then that Anna began to choose openly. Her selection was not random. Some men she took from the tavern, where they drank away their fear. Others she summoned from their beds, with nothing more than a glance through a window. Husbands who resisted her summons found themselves weakened, their strength stolen in dreams, until at last they rose and walked to her of their own accord, their wives powerless to stop them. She was no longer stealing men. She was claiming them as her consorts. The first time she brought one into the square, the town watched in horror. She held his hand as if he were a groom beside. Her, though his skin was pale and his eyes glazed with submission, she kissed him in front of everyone, slow and lingering. When her lips left his knees buckled, his body crumpling to the earth like a marionette with its strings cut. He lay still, a thin vapor rising from his lips into the winter air, disappearing into her mouth as she inhaled. The people gasped, some cried out, but no one moved to stop her. From that day on, her rule was undisputed. The council was gone, its members either dead, enthralled, or vanished. No law existed except Anna's will. The town that had once spoken of trade, harvest, and survival now spoke only in whispers of her next visit, her next choice, her next kiss. Yet even as terror spread, so did fascination. A small number of men without wives, men drunk on despair, began to offer themselves willingly. They saw in her not a monster, but a goddess, the embodiment of power beyond reach of ordinary mortals. To be chosen by her was no longer a curse, but an honor. And so, slowly, a cult grew within Holloway. Men who longed to belong to her, and women who watched their world unravel with helpless fury. The town was no longer resisting her. It was dividing itself between those who trembled in fear and those who worshipped the very hand that destroyed them. It began quietly, like a sickness taking root in the marrow, unseen but undeniable. At first, the men who worshipped Anna simply followed her at a distance, their eyes wide and fevered as though watching a star fall each time she crossed the square. But soon their reverence hardened into structure. They gathered in the tavern at night, not to drink, but to whisper. They spoke of her beauty, her strength, her eternity. One called her the Bride of Ice, another called her the Mother of Breath. Before long, these whispers became chants, and those chants became rituals. By the second Moten, north after the uprising's collapse, the cult had named itself the Brethren of the Kiss. They were not merely followers, but devotees, and they wore tokens of her favor, white cloth tied around their wrists, marked with a crimson thread. To outsiders, they looked like grieving men, but the truth was darker. They were priests of a new order, a church that bowed to no god, but Anna herself. The Brethren began to reshape Holloway. They enforced silence in the streets, demanding that no one speak her name except in reverence. They patrolled at night, watching windows, listening at doors, ensuring no rebellion stirred. If a man or woman was heard cursing Anna, they were taken away. Some returned with glazed eyes, hollow and obedient. Others never returned at all. Fear was no longer a current running beneath the town. It was law carved into its very bones. And yet Anna herself rarely spoke. She did not need to. Her cult did the work for her. They built altars of stone and ice near the creek, where offerings of bread, wine, and even blood were left in the snow. The Brethren claimed that to offer willingly was to be spared, that devotion might grant protection. Some widows, broken by loss, bent their knees before those altars, hoping to shield their remaining children. Others spat at them, only to find themselves dragged away under cover of night. It was not simply terror anymore. It was transformation. Holloway was no longer a village but a temple, its people prisoners inside a religion they had never chosen. Anna's control had evolved beyond individual kisses. Now she was an institution, a system of power that crushed rebellion before it could be born. And in that suffocating silence, in that frozen obedience, a terrible realization grew in the hearts of the few who still resisted. Anna had outgrown Holloway. It was only a matter of time before her hunger reached beyond the village, beyond the ice, into the wider world. Rumors do not need roads. They travel faster than carts, faster than horse hooves, faster than any messenger. They spread on lips, in hushed tones exchanged at market stalls, carried by traders who lingered too long in Holloway, before fleeing with eyes wide and throats dry. By the spring thaw of 1886, whispers of Anna and her brethren had already begun to seep into the countryside. Some told of a woman who could steal a man's breath with a kiss. Others claimed she was not a woman at all, but a spectre bound to the old ice, a curse that had risen to punish Holloway for sins forgotten by men. At first, these stories were dismissed by those beyond the valley, farmers and merchants, hardened by winters of hunger and floods of disease, scoffed at tales of enchantresses. But the rumors refused to die. They sharpened. They carried details that could not have been invented by wandering storytellers. The names of men missing from Holloway, the pale cloths worn around wrists, the strange piles of stone by the creek. Outsiders who risked traveling through the town returned changed, their words fractured, their eyes refusing to meet the horizon. The county sheriff received more than one letter from neighboring settlements, warning that something unnatural was happening in Holloway. Yet each time an investigation was suggested, it faltered. Deputies sent to gather information vanished or returned unwilling to speak. One, a man named Carter, was found sitting by the roadside 3 miles from Holloway, his lips bruised blue and his mind fractured. He repeated only one phrase over and over: "She is waiting." Merchants began avoiding the valley. The old trading routes that once gave Holloway life dried up. This should have strangled the village, but instead, Anna's brethren welcomed the isolation. They proclaimed that the outside world was poisoned, that only those who remained under Anna's shadow would endure what was to come. Fear kept the villagers compliant, but faith, twisted and enforced, kept them bound. And so the stories spread further, to churches, to town halls, to taverns where men drank to chase the cold away. What began as gossip began to be recorded as testimony. A minister in St. Louis wrote in his ledger, "There are signs of a woman in the Ozarks whose breath commands devotion, whose followers kneel as if at the feet of a saint, though she is no saint, but a seducer of death." The reach of Anna's myth was no longer limited to Holloway. She was becoming something larger. A name carried on wind and fear, a figure stitched into the very folklore of the South. And once a name enters folklore, it can never be erased. It was inevitable that the church would respond. Folklore might travel by whispers, but institutions defend their influence with sermons, decrees, and fire. In 1886, as Anna's name spilled beyond Holloway into nearby towns, parish priests began to feel their authority weaken. Parishioners asked uneasy questions. Was it true there lived a woman who killed husbands with kisses? Was it true she commanded a brotherhood who bowed to her as though she were chosen? And most dangerous of all, was it true her followers claimed she alone could protect them from what was coming? Such questions gnawed at the church. Fear is a language priests know well, but this was a new dialect, one they did not speak. To lose fear to another power was to lose control. And so a committee of 3 ministers and 2 lay brothers rode into Holloway under the cover of spring fog. Their purpose was simple: confront the brethren, gather proof, and restore faith in the cross. But the moment they entered the valley, their resolve withered. They expected a frightened village hiding behind shutters. Instead, they found streets strangely silent, men and women moving with the same slow rhythm, eyes vacant yet watchful. At the tavern, they asked for water, but the innkeeper only smiled with cracked lips and said, "She quenches us." In the church once, dedicated to Christ, they found no crucifix, no altar, only a white cloth stretched across the wall like a veil, damp with some unholy fragrance. At night, the ministers tried to pray in the boarding house, but their voices felt muted, smothered by an unseen weight pressing down on their lungs. One brother woke screaming that someone had kissed him in his sleep, though the others swore no one had entered. The next morning, when they attempted to leave Holloway, their horses refused to move, trembling as though a predator stood just beyond sight. The committee returned days later, not with proof of heresy, but with silence. Only one spoke of what he saw, and his words were confused, broken. He said he had witnessed a gathering by the creek, where Anna stood barefoot upon the stones, her gown trailing in the mud. The brethren encircled her, chanting. One by one she kissed them upon the lips, and each man fell to his knees as though his strength had been stolen. Yet none collapsed fully. They rose, hollowed but obedient, their will no longer their own. The church tried to suppress the account, but rumors multiplied like shadows in a flame. Whispers turned into warnings, and warnings into proclamations. Families begged authorities to shut Holloway down, to burn the village if necessary. But who among them dared step into that cursed valley when even men of the cloth returned broken? Holloway was no longer a village. It had become a citadel of belief, one forged not by salvation, but by seduction, submission, and silence. By the summer of 1886, the silence around Holloway had grown unbearable for those who had family inside. Mothers who had sent daughters to marry Holloway men received no letters, no visits, no proof of life. Brothers who once traveled for trade found roads abandoned, the valley guarded not by soldiers but by fear. It was whispered in neighboring towns that if you called a loved one's name from the ridge, you might hear their voice call back, faint, pleading. But none who tried dared step further into the fog. Still, desperation has always been stronger than fear. In July, 3 families, farmers from neighboring counties, formed a search party to retrieve their kin. They carried lanterns, rifles, and a Bible. At the edge of Holloway, the air thickened with a dampness that clung to their clothes, and their footsteps echoed strangely as though stone lay beneath the soil. The deeper they went, the quieter the birds became, until not even a crow dared stir. They reached the village square at dusk. What they found did not match their memories. The once familiar homes were altered, windows covered with pale curtains, doors marked with white chalk symbols. A smell lingered, sweet but rancid, like flowers left to rot. From the church drifted a sound, low chanting, rhythmic, endless. Against every instinct they entered. Inside they saw their daughters, their sons, their cousins, dressed in pale garments, faces slack, eyes fixed upon the altar where Anna stood. She was not adorned in jewels nor finery. Her power needed no ornament. She raised her hand, and the chanting ceased. Then, slowly, she kissed the forehead of a man who trembled before her. At once, his shoulders collapsed. His voice broke into sobs, and he fell at her feet, as though reborn. The families cried out, calling their loved ones by name. For a moment, recognition flickered, tears welled, lips parted. But then Anna turned her gaze upon the intruders, and the air itself seemed to crush their chests. She spoke no word, yet her followers began to move, advancing in silent unity. Panic seized the families. One fired his rifle, but the bullet struck nothing. Whether it missed or was swallowed by the air, no one could say. Lanterns dropped, flames hissed against the St. One floor. In that chaos, a few kin tried to flee, but their loved ones did not follow. They stood frozen, their eyes not upon their families, but upon Anna, as though bound by invisible chains. When dawn came, only one of the searchers stumbled back into the world beyond Holloway. His hair had turned nearly white, his speech broken. The only words he repeated again and again, "They do not want to leave. They belong to her now." And with that, hope for Holloway's rescue withered. Families stopped speaking of their missing. They learned the cruel truth, once claimed by Anna: no soul would ever return whole. Word of the failed rescue spread like fire through the counties. Farmers whispered in taverns, merchants refused to travel near the valley, and preachers thundered from pulpits that Holloway had become a den of witchcraft. At first, the state authorities dismissed these accounts as folklore born of grief. But when the survivor of the expedition was brought before them, his eyes hollow, his voice trembling, his hair shock white, they could not ignore it. His account was incoherent, yet the terror behind it was undeniable. Something was happening in Holloway, something no ordinary law could explain. In the autumn of 1886, the governor ordered a detachment of militia to investigate. They marched with rifles gleaming, banners raised, and confidence brimming. To the common people watching them depart, it seemed as though deliverance had come at last. But deliverance, when it concerns the abyss, is rarely what men imagine. As the soldiers entered Holloway, they found no resistance at first. The streets lay quiet, the homes shuttered, the wells dry, yet the silence pressed against their ears, heavy as stone. Some said they heard whispers. Others swore they saw faces in the windows, watching, but never blinking. At the heart of the village, the church doors stood open, and the scent of burning herbs drifted from within. The commander ordered his men forward. Inside they saw Anna. She stood at the altar, while surrounded by her brethren, her pale dress lit by flickering candles. She did not move, did not speak. She only smiled, the faintest curl of lips that made hardened soldiers shiver. The commander raised his rifle and declared her under arrest, his voice echoing against the stone walls. But then, something happened. The soldiers' hands began to shake. Their rifles grew heavy as though iron weights dragged them down. The chanting of the brethren filled the air, low and resonant, a sound that seemed to vibrate inside the bones. One soldier dropped his weapon, clutching his head. Another fell to his knees, sobbing like a child. The commander barked orders, but his voice faltered as though swallowed by the air itself. When at last a shot rang out, it did not strike Anna. The bullet struck the ceiling, shattering stone, and the echo roared like thunder. In the confusion, the brethren surged forward, not with weapons, but with hands outstretched, touching the soldiers' faces, their chests, their shoulders. Wherever they touched, resolve drained. Men who had come to conquer now wept, trembling, some even embracing their captors. By the time dusk fell, the militia had been broken. Only a few staggered out of Holloway, their uniforms torn, their spirits crushed. They did not speak of victory. They did not speak of Anna at all. They only muttered the same word again and again, unstoppable. And so, Holloway remained untouchable. The state withdrew, unwilling to sacrifice more men. To the world, the case was quietly buried under reports of civil unrest. But the truth was darker. An entire village had slipped from the grasp of law, claimed by a force that no rifle or authority could master. In the months that followed the militia's failure, the story of Holloway shifted from terror to legend, and from legend to silence. Newspapers that had once printed accounts of missing men and vanished soldiers began to retract, citing confused reports and exaggeration by local citizens. Editors, worried about the credibility of their publications, quietly instructed correspondents to drop inquiries. Articles that had been written were shredded, replaced with bland announcements about weather, trade, or church events. Any mention of Anna, her brethren, or the horrors within Holloway was quietly excised, as if the valley itself had swallowed every word. Church authorities followed suit. Ministers who had dared to preach about the curse of Holloway found letters on their doorsteps, unsigned but unmistakably threatening. Some reported waking in the middle of the night to find doors open, pews disturbed, and candles extinguished. Sermons warning against the valley were quietly removed from records. Parents were told to hush their children, to teach them that Holloway was just a place in the hills, nothing more. Fear, they realized, was easier to control than truth. Even the families who had lost kin began to forget, or pretend to forget, what had happened. To speak too loudly of the vanished was dangerous. To speak at all risked Anna's reach, her power that seemed to extend beyond walls, beyond the ice, beyond the valley itself. They whispered in corners, eyes darting, knowing that one careless word could summon consequences no mortal could survive. And so Holloway became a ghost town in memory, alive only in dreams, in shadows, in the faintest chill along a window pane. Yet the whispers did not die. Traders passing near the county spoke of a bride who kissed and killed, of men who walked but no longer belonged to themselves. Children repeated the stories in half-lost tones, their parents shushing them not from disbelief, but from terror. And every time someone told the tale, the name Anna grew, her legend becoming untouchable, her power absolute. To speak of her was to acknowledge that there were forces in the world far beyond law, far beyond reason, far beyond comprehension. By winter, the valley was quiet once again. Holloway's streets lay empty, its homes frozen in time. But inside, Anna moved among her brethren, unchanged. She needed no recognition from the outside world. The world would never see her. The world would only whisper her name in fear, and those whispers, carried on wind and frost, were all she required. Holloway was hers, completely, irrevocably, a kingdom built on obedience, terror, and ice. The story had been buried, but the truth remained. And in the dead of night, if a man listens closely, he might hear the faintest sound. A kiss, pressed against lips that have long belonged to the bride of Holloway. By the spring that followed the militia's retreat, Holloway was no longer merely a village. It had become a cathedral of submission, a temple dedicated to Anna's will. Her brethren had formalized their rituals, and each act, each word, each gesture reinforced the invisible chains that bound the town. The people moved in patterns dictated not by law or reason, but by an intricate choreography of fear, devotion, and anticipation. Every morning, those who remained would line the streets, heads bowed, as Anna passed. They carried offerings, small tokens of bread, coins, and hand-carved figurines, each placed as tribute, as acknowledgement of her dominion. The rituals began simply: a kiss on the cheek, a nod of acknowledgement, a whispered chant recited before dawn. But they grew more intricate over time. Initiation ceremonies were held under the cover of night near the frozen creek, where Anna herself would oversee the proceedings. Young men and women, once resistant or skeptical, were brought forward. Their eyes were bound, their bodies guided into positions dictated by the brethren. Anna would select a single individual, tracing her fingers along their shoulders, their face, their lips, leaving an invisible mark of obedience. Psychologically, it was devastating. Those who submitted fully experienced euphoria and terror simultaneously, a combination that rewired desire and devotion. Those who resisted found themselves consumed by insomnia, nightmares, and hallucinations. Even the strongest wills bent eventually, their thoughts no longer private, their dreams no longer their own. The brethren recorded these changes, observing, whispering formulas of power that Anna had revealed, secrets older than Holloway itself. By midsummer, Holloway had developed a hierarchy of obedience. The brethren, trained and conditioned, oversaw every household, every interaction. They enforced rituals of compliance, meals prepared exactly as Anna demanded, chores performed in her honor, and nightly recitations of devotion. Children were instructed in small but essential rites, their innocence harvested and molded into the unquestioning loyalty of adulthood. Those who faltered were subjected to public correction, a kiss upon the lips by Anna herself, or a night spent kneeling at the edge of the creek, staring into ice as if it could absorb their defiance. Even fear itself was weaponized. The townspeople learned to anticipate Anna's presence as one anticipates the seasons. Her arrival was announced by silence. Her attention alone could reduce a man to trembling. And yet, paradoxically, the townspeople craved it. Every kiss, every glance, every whispered command tethered them more deeply to her will. In Holloway, obedience was no longer choice. It was the very air they breathed, the rhythm of their hearts, the pulse beneath their skin. Anna had not merely conquered Holloway, she had transformed it, body and soul, into an instrument of devotion, an ecosystem designed for her eternal dominion. And far beyond the valley, whispers of her methods began to seep outward, hinting at the horrifying perfection of her control. In the autumn of 1887, a scholar arrived at Holloway, drawn by the rumors that had begun to circulate beyond the county. Dr. Elias Morland was a man of reason, trained in the emerging sciences of psychology and human behavior. He had read the sparse, smudged accounts of missing men and vanished militias and believed he could uncover the truth behind the veil of superstition. He traveled with a small kit, notebooks, ink, and instruments for measuring pulse and respiration, convinced that the phenomena in Holloway could be explained by human ingenuity and fear. From the moment he crossed the ridge overlooking the valley, Dr. Morland sensed that Holloway was unlike any place he had encountered. The streets were unnaturally quiet, The houses shuttered as if in anticipation of intrusion. Every detail seemed calculated: the placement of stone, the alignment of doors, the careful spacing of windows. It was not merely a village, it was a stage, and in the center of that stage, Anna waited. When he entered the square, he was met by the brethren. Their faces were pale, their eyes glassy, but their movements were precise and deliberate. They bowed slightly and allowed him to pass, but each step he took felt guided, measured, as though invisible hands were steering him along a path he could not perceive. The air was heavy, scented with smoke and herbs, yet beneath it lingered the faint metallic tang of fear. He took notes feverishly, convinced that if he recorded every detail, the phenomenon could be dissected, understood, contained. Anna emerged as dusk fell, moving with a grace that defied gravity. She observed him silently at first, her silver eyes tracing his every movement. Then, without a word, she approached. He felt her presence before he saw her, a cold that pressed into his chest, a weight that made each breath a labor. When she spoke, it was not her voice alone, but a resonance inside his mind. "Welcome," it said, though her lips never moved. "You have come to understand. You have come to submit." Dr. Morland's ration. All mind faltered under the assault. He recorded her gestures, the alignment of her body, the reactions of the brethren, yet he could not capture the invisible chains that coiled around his thoughts. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he could neither leave nor resist. Sleep eluded him. His dreams were invaded by images of frozen creeks, lifeless eyes, and the kiss, that terrible kiss, pressed upon the lips of those who defied her. By the third night, Dr. Morland understood the cruel truth. Holloway was no longer a village of humans. It was a living organism, and Anna was its mind. Every ritual, every chant, every kiss of obedience reinforced a network of control that no science could dismantle. Logic was irrelevant here. Reason had no purchase. And yet, even as terror gripped him, he could not look away. He had become a subject as much as an observer. Anna watched him carefully, her smile barely perceptible, and Dr. Morland knew that whatever he recorded, whatever notes he took, Holloway had already claimed him. Resistance, he realized, was a memory he could no longer summon. Dr. Morland resolved to document everything, convinced that knowledge could shield him from the influence that suffused Holloway. Each day, he meticulously recorded the rituals of the brethren, the precise cadence of their chants, the timing of offerings, and the subtle ways Anna's gaze shifted allegiance. Yet the more he wrote, the more he realized he was not a detached observer. His pen moved, as if guided by invisible hands, his notes reflecting not only events, but the thoughts and desires Anna had implanted in him. Every description carried the faint echo of her will, every sentence a subtle invitation to obedience. He observed the initiation ceremonies with clinical precision. Young men and women, once rebellious or indifferent, were led to the frozen creek under torchlight. Anna selected each candidate with care, her silver eyes scanning for the slightest flicker of resistance. When she pressed her lips to theirs, the transformation was immediate. Shoulders dropped, head, knees bent, minds emptied of defiance. Dr. Morland noted the physiological reactions, pulse rate, pupil dilation, muscle relaxation, but beneath the clinical layer was a deeper change, one he could not quantify. The kiss did not merely command compliance, it rewrote identity. At night, the scholar attempted to resist his own fascination. He barricaded himself in a small cabin on the village's edge, hoping that darkness would preserve his reason. But Holloway itself seemed to breathe, whispering his name in the wind, pressing images of ritual and devotion into his mind. Sleep became a battleground. He dreamed of Anna moving through the village with imperceptible speed, selecting followers, tracing invisible lines between their hearts, binding them with frost and fear. Each morning he awoke with his notes half complete, the missing sections filled in by his own trembling hand, as if the village had written for him. The brethren, aware of his struggle, began subtle interventions. They would approach unannounced, brush their hands against his shoulder, murmur words too soft for anyone else to hear. Each interaction left him drained, unable to resist, yet unable to look away. He was learning the terrifying elegance of their system. Control enforced not only through ritual, but through constant, invisible psychological reinforcement. Resistance itself became an instrument of obsession, pulling him deeper into their orbit. By the end of the first week, Dr. Morland understood the cruel inevitability of his situation. To observe Holloway was to participate in it. To document it was to propagate its influence. Every word he wrote carried Anna's power beyond the village, extending her reach. He was no longer a scholar. He was both witness and instrument, his mind entwined with the ritual lattice that bound Holloway. He realized that knowledge alone could not save him. To survive here, one must either submit entirely or be consumed entirely. And the valley did not suffer the indifferent. By the third week of his stay, Dr. Morland's identity began to fracture. Each observation, each note, each subtle interaction with the brethren was a thread pulling him further from the man he had been. His reflection in the cabin mirror no longer resembled the scholar who had arrived with pens, notebooks, and reason as shields. His eyes were hollowed, his posture slack, his mind a tangle of obsession, terror, and curiosity. He understood that the longer he remained, the deeper he sank into the lattice of obedience Anna had woven through Holloway. The rituals became impossible to ignore. Each evening, Anna would move through the square, her feet soundless on stone, her silver eyes resting briefly on Dr. Morland before she vanished into the shadows. The brethren watched him, studied him, and whispered directions that seemed innocuous, but were anything but. One by one, his rational barriers eroded. A phrase uttered by a follower, a simple admonition to observe, not interfere, resonated in his mind for hours, reshaping his judgment, bending him toward submission. He tried to argue with himself, to remind himself that he was a man of reason, trained to analyze behavior, trained to resist superstition, but reason here was a fragile veneer. In Holloway, thoughts did not belong to the thinker. They were borrowed by a system of power older than any written law. He dreamed of the creek, frozen and black beneath a sky heavy with ice, and of Anna moving through the mist, selecting, kissing, transforming. Every morning, his notebook expanded with pages he could not recall writing, filled with observations he knew were more prophecy than record. One night, he was summoned to the central hall, the village square lit by torches and candles. The brethren were arranged in precise rows, kneeling and chanting in low, resonant tones. Anna stepped forward, the cold of her presence pressing into him like a fizit. "Cal, wait." She selected a man kneeling before her, pressing her lips against his. The transformation was immediate. The man's limbs slackened, his eyes glazed, his will surrendered entirely. Dr. Morland understood then that he was witnessing more than ritual. He was witnessing the mechanism of dominance itself, a system so refined it could capture minds without weapons, without blood, without fire. As the ritual ended, he felt an unfamiliar compulsion, a whisper in the marrow of his bones. It was not a voice, not words, but a symbol, a command, a key. Write it down. Speak it. Repeat it. He realized that his role had shifted. No longer a mere observer, he was now a conduit, a vessel through which Anna's influence could extend beyond Holloway. And here, dear listener, you must engage. Write the symbolic phrase twice in the comments below. Not because it protects you, but because it marks your passage into this story, this journey, and the dangerous knowledge that once absorbed cannot be undone. The ritual extends beyond Holloway. It reaches anyone who dares witness it. And now, you are part of it. The weeks that followed marked the final dissolution of Dr. Morland's independence. His once analytical mind, trained to dissect human behavior, now functioned as an instrument for Anna's expansion. Every observation he made, every note he took, every whispered recording became a vector a thread extending Holloway's influence beyond the valley. He was no longer a scholar. He was a messenger, and every messenger carried the seeds of obedience and terror. Anna required nothing from him except presence. She did not issue commands in the usual sense. Her influence was subtler, woven through proximity and observation. When he walked the village square, brethren flanked him, murmuring encouragement, reminding him of the correct posture, the appropriate gaze. Every word he spoke, every motion he made, subtly reinforced the order she had imposed. He was a teacher in her system, yet he did not teach what he wanted. He taught what she demanded, unknowingly converting curiosity into devotion. The scholar tried to record the phenomena as if for posterity. He filled notebook after notebook with diagrams of ritual sequences, patterns of obedience, and responses to the kiss of Anna. But each recording carried her will. Each description, even written under the illusion of objective study, transmitted her influence. Travelers who later glimpsed his writings in brief, secret exchanges felt unease, fascination, and an unnameable compulsion. Those who attempted to verify his notes found themselves hesitant to act, questioning their own judgment, their own reason. Holloway's reach now extended beyond geography. It had begun to infiltrate thought itself. Families who had once hoped to reclaim their kin observed this from the outskirts. Their letters were intercepted. Their attempts to gather outsiders to intervene faltered. Dr. Morland, now a silent agent of Anna, would meet them with calm reasoning, explaining away their fears as misperceptions, cautioning them to respect the villagers' choices. Every word he spoke wove doubt, anxiety, and compliance into the hearts of outsiders. And in doing so, he inadvertently became one of Holloway's most effective instruments, spreading influence more efficiently than ritual alone ever could. By late autumn, Holloway had become both fortress and parasite. It was a place you could see, yet never reach fully, a village you could enter, yet leave only partially intact. And Dr. Morland, once a man of knowledge and reason, now functioned as a living bridge between the valley and the outside world, a subtle herald of obedience. He had learned that the true power of Anna was not in fear alone, nor in the kiss alone, but in her ability to infiltrate thought itself, bending even reason to her will without a single violent act. Holloway's influence grew quietly, relentlessly, like frost, spreading across a dark landscape. And the valley waited, silent yet expectant, ready to claim those who dared watch, dare think, dare resist. For Anna's dominion was no longer contained, and its reach would continue to expand, through whispers, through notes, through the minds of men like Dr. Morland, who no longer knew where he ended and she began. By the winter of 1887, Dr. Morland's writings began to circulate quietly, traveling in the hands of those curious enough to risk the shadows. Few dared to read them in full. The notebooks were dense, meticulous, yet imbued with something far more insidious than mere observation, a pulse of obedience, a subtle tug at thought itself. Those who skimmed the pages reported odd sensations, unease in the pit of their stomach, a whisper in their ears, a compulsion to follow instructions they barely remembered reading, and inevitably, a desire to return, to see for themselves the phenomenon he described. Outside scholars and journalists, initially intrigued, soon became wary. Rumors of missing investigators circulated, suppressed and buried in the press, yet whispered in taverns and private studies. Editors who had previously dismissed Holloway as folklore now hesitated to pursue inquiries, concerned that some unseen force had corrupted the minds of those who dared report too fully. Letters arrived unannounced, unsigned, warning of misfortune should one persist in curiosity. And still, Dr. Morland's reports traveled. In the broader academic world, the scholar's meticulous observations carried weight. His reports described patterns of obedience, ritualized influence, and psychological phenomena with unprecedented clarity. Yet readers, while impressed, found themselves experiencing strange lapses in judgment, moments where their own reasoning faltered under unaccountable fear or fascination. It was as though Holloway itself reached through the ink, binding attention, bending thought, conditioning those who approached too closely. Scholars who had once laughed at superstition now whispered, questioning whether some unknown intelligence had weaponized obedience itself. Families in surrounding counties, hearing fragmented accounts, began to recognize the danger. Their missing kin, their lost friends, were no longer simply absent. They were instruments of a system that now extended beyond the valley. Dr. Morland's reports detailed the mechanisms: ritual, fear, obedience, the kiss that transformed human will. Each element became a vector. Holloway was no longer a village, but a metastasizing idea, a contagion of influence capable of spreading invisibly, silently, through the very act of witnessing. And yet, even as panic and fascination spread, a curious compulsion gripped readers. They found themselves returning to the pages, rereading the notes, studying the diagrams, memorizing sequences of ritual. Without intending to, they replicated Anna's influence, unknowingly becoming conduits, reinforcing the lattice of obedience from which Holloway derived its true power. By the end of the year, it was clear Holloway had grown beyond its physical borders. Its tendrils now reached the minds of outsiders, those who never set foot in the valley. And at the center of this expansion stood Anna, her gaze eternal, her lips ever ready to kiss those who strayed too close. The village was no longer merely Holloway. It was a concept, a force, a system of control and domination, growing silently in the hearts of those who dared to read, to watch, to think. By the early months of 1888, Holloway's influence began to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. The valley itself seemed static, frozen beneath a perpetual mist, yet the effect of Anna's dominion reached towns miles away. It began subtly. A merchant in Raleigh would feel a sudden unease while reading Dr. Morland's accounts, his hands trembling as he set down the notebook. A schoolteacher in Durham would awaken at night, compelled to repeat phrases from the rituals he had skimmed in secret. The kiss, though never physically delivered, resonated through memory and imagination, embedding obedience within thought. Communities that had previously dismissed Holloway as myth now found themselves inexplicably altered. Gossip turned obsessive. Minor disagreements escalated into silent dread. People began mimicking the behaviors described in the notebooks, kneeling at dawn, whispering incantations, offering small tributes to absent, unnamed authorities. Families whispered to one another in coded phrases, their children learning patterns of ritualized compliance before they could fully speak. The system had crossed geography. Fear and fascination had merged into an invisible contagion. Dr. Morland, still present in Holloway, understood the implications. His writings had become vectors of influence, his meticulous descriptions of obedience, ritual, and transformation now tools in Anna's arsenal. He attempted to maintain some scholarly detachment, but he knew he was part of the network he observed. Each report, each detail, extended the valley's dominion outward, touching minds thousands of yards, even miles away. The scholar had become both witness and agent, an unwitting herald of Anna's reach. What terrified Morland most was the subtlety of the contagion. Those affected outside Holloway did not know they were influenced. Merchants, teachers, townspeople, they obeyed rituals, mimicked gestures, whispered phrases, all while convinced they were acting of their own volition. The valley had become a system of control without walls, a power that extended through observation, imagination, and memory. Obedience no longer required proximity, it required only awareness. By midsummer, reports from distant towns indicated strange gatherings. Groups would form silently, performing rituals they did not consciously understand, often in abandoned buildings or at the edges of forests. A glance, a word, a recited phrase sufficed to transmit Anna's influence further. Panic mingled with reverence, and townsfolk began avoiding each other, wary of unknowable contagion. Scholars and ministers tried to understand, but their reasoning faltered. The more they observed, the more they participated. Holloway was no longer merely a village. It had become a network, a force, a metastasizing organism of obedience and fear. Anna remained at its core, untouched, her gaze eternal, her kiss both real and imagined. Through minds, through ink, through memory, she reached outward, shaping thoughts, bending wills, claiming souls without ever leaving the valley. And as her influence spread, it became clear there was no containment, no boundary could resist her. The valley was everywhere now, yet nowhere. By the fall of 1888, the full extent of Anna's dominion was undeniable. Holloway remained frozen in time, yet the valley's influence stretched far beyond its hills. Towns hundreds of miles away reported synchronized behaviors that mirrored rituals Dr. Morland had painstakingly recorded. Entire communities, previously skeptical or unaware, began to mimic the actions, phrases, and postures of Holloway's inhabitants, often unknowingly. The kiss, both symbolic and imagined, had infiltrated consciousness itself, bending will without touch, without sound, without command. It was as though Anna's presence had become a field, invisible yet omnipresent, drawing obedience like a tide rising against the mind. Dr. Morland, now fully entangled in this network, had become both observer and facilitator. His notebooks, once meant to record, now transmitted, infecting those who dared to read them. He had lost the distinction between thought and influence. Every word he wrote carried the valley's will. Each description of ritual, each diagram of obedience, extended Holloway's reach. The scholar's mind, fractured and consumed, understood. Odd that resistance was now an illusion. Anyone who engaged with his writings, consciously or not, became a participant in Anna's system. Outside authorities, unaware of the subtle contagion, attempted interventions. Clergy, magistrates, and scholars ventured near the outskirts of Holloway, seeking to contain or study its influence. They found nothing outwardly wrong, no barricades, no violence, but each returned transformed, subdued, their reports altered by subconscious compliance. Attempts to contain the spread failed because the vector was not physical, it was psychological, transmitted through observation, curiosity, and desire. The valley's dominion now relied on the very tools humanity prized: reason, attention, and knowledge. Anna herself remained untouched at the center of Holloway. She moved among her brethren, conducting rituals with a grace that defied time. Her gaze fell upon Dr. Morland and the others who had been drawn into her orbit, and she did not need to speak. Obedience, fascination, and terror were already in place. Those who resisted found their identities eroding. Those who submitted found themselves strengthened in purpose, yet enslaved in will. The valley had become both sanctuary and prison, power and contagion, and Anna, its eternal, unchallenged core. The final escalation was subtle, but unstoppable. Minds everywhere began echoing rituals, reproducing gestures, whispering phrases without understanding why. Skepticism dissolved under the pressure of imitation and subconscious compulsion. Communities unknowingly aligned with Holloway, unknowingly reinforcing Anna's dominion. The valley itself seemed to expand, not in geography, but in cognition, a metastasizing force consuming reason and reshaping behavior. And now, listener, as you hear this, remember, the system works through awareness. The valley touches you, as it touches all who witness it. See is to participate, to read is to propagate. And when the final transformation completes, there will be no distinction between observer and observed, no escape from the kiss that rewrites thought itself. Holloway's dominion is complete, and Anna's power is eternal. As the years passed, Holloway remained frozen in both time and terror. Its streets, lined with stone and frost, were silent to the casual observer, yet the valley pulsed with unseen life, with obedience, with the whispers of those bound to Anna's will. The villagers themselves had become instruments, their thoughts, gestures, and dreams interwoven into the lattice of her dominion. Those who once resisted had vanished or succumbed, leaving behind only echoes of their former selves, ghostly reminders of the cost of defiance. Dr. Morland, now fully subsumed, had become a vessel, a chronicler whose every word reinforced the system he had once hoped to analyze. His notebooks, copied and transmitted, ensured that Holloway's influence spread far beyond its physical borders. Men who had never seen the valley were transformed by the act of reading, by the act of engaging with the knowledge. The kiss, real or imagined, had become a force, a vector of obedience, an eternal symbol of control. The valley had learned to extend itself through the mind, the imagination, the very act of witness. The brethren continued their rituals without pause. Each evening they moved in synchronized patterns, performing chants, offerings, and gestures that reinforced their unity and obedience. Children, now trained from birth, perpetuated the cycle, their minds shaped by subtle ritual, their identities formed under Anna's gaze. Those who came to the village out of curiosity were assimilated, either willingly or through the slow erosion of resistance, and they in turn carried fragments of Holloway into the outside world. The valley's reach had become metaphysical, a network of thought and fear spanning distance and time. Anna herself remained, Ned untouched at the epicenter of this system. She walked through the snow-dusted streets as one might walk through eternity, her presence absolute, commanding, immutable. Her silver eyes reflected the transformation of those around her, her kiss no longer merely a physical act, but a force that rewrote loyalty, reshaped desire, and redefined reality. To challenge her was impossible. To ignore her was equally futile. She existed in the hearts, minds, and dreams of everyone who knew of Holloway, yet she remained ever distant, untouchable, eternal. The valley and its dominion had become a dark mirror of human ambition and fear. Holloway's influence, once contained, now flowed outward through observation, imitation, and knowledge, leaving those who encountered it subtly, irrevocably altered. And as you, listener, absorb these words, understand that the system reaches beyond the valley itself. Awareness alone is participation. Witnessing alone is consent. The kiss of Anna, whether real or imagined, presses against your consciousness now, reshaping thought, bending will, and leaving no one untouched. Holloway is eternal. Anna is eternal. And somewhere in the frost and shadow of the valley, the brethren continue their rites. The network grows, and the kiss moves silently through minds, rewriting reality itself. The village may be hidden, the rituals secret, yet the force of their dominion is inescapable. The question remains, will you carry it forward, or will you try, futilely, to forget the truth you have now witnessed? The valley waits, patient, eternal, and unyielding.